You're listening to Inside IASB, a podcast series dedicated to informing and encouraging Illinois School Board members. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Isaac Warren. I'm the Director of Digital Communications at the Illinois Association of School Board. And with me today, I have Sandra Quassa from our Lombard office to talk about the monitoring district goals using data in district workshops. So, Sandra, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And before we begin, could you just give our listeners a little bit of background, what your job is at IASB and what you do here?
Yes, my name is Sandra Quassa. I have been with the association for about 18 years now, and I am in board development, which is now called training development. I've been a field services director as well. And so that's just a little bit about me. I enjoy working, facilitating workshops and creating and developing workshops for members of our association.
Yeah. And so we're really excited to have the expert on the district workshops on the podcast to talk about this exciting new one, because living in a very data-centric world is becoming more important to not only learn how to interpret the data, but also communicate it to people who may not be as in tune with how to analyze data. So this is really great. So just to get started, can you give us a general overview of this new monitoring district goals using data workshop and what participants can expect to learn in it?
Yes, I'd love to do that. It took us about a year to develop this workshop, and there were several of us that were working together trying to figure out what was the best thing. What did we really, truly want our participants to learn? And we kind of came up with three objectives. First of all, we just want people to understand why monitoring is an important activity for the board. It is a workshop centered around boards. However, we will talk a little bit later about how it includes the superintendent and staff as well, because together they will be able to produce good data for the community. So the first thing is understanding why monitoring is an important activity for the board. The second thing is learning how data can be organized and presented to the board. And as I just mentioned, and the public.
Yes.
I kind of see the premise of this workshop is that the constructive use of data is a skill that must be learned. So people will come into the workshop at different levels, and it's okay. Wherever you are is where you should be. The board should have some understanding eventually of data, but will typically require guidance from the staff. So it's not about making anyone an expert, but it is about being able to communicate and collaborate with staff so that we make good data-informed decisions. We want to identify data that the board will use to monitor their student learning goals. So this is a workshop customized to individuals. We will have a board team, board superintendent, governance team working together. And through the workshop, they will be specifically focusing on monitoring student outcomes. The techniques taught can, however, be used to monitor any district goals. So most of the workshop is a work session specifically designed to come out with how are you going to monitor your student performance. And so those are our expectations for the workshop.
Excellent. And, talking about student performance, that's obviously a very critical data point to have and to be able to communicate effectively. In general, why is it important for school districts to monitor their goals using data?
Yeah, I would just simply state that monitoring, which is an ongoing process, ensures performance and it promotes accountability to whom? To the board, to the staff, to the community. It also promotes learning and continuous improvement. I just want to use what I think of as a familiar scenario to kind of answer that question. Sure. Board members are constantly asked the question, how is your school district doing? I hear it all the time. It's a simple request. But what if a board member answers by stating the children are doing well? Based on what? Their own personal perception. But if you actually look at the data, it shows that children are performing below state standards. In this case, and in many cases, data provides proof that will reduce and possibly eliminate decisions and assessments based on incomplete or biased information and or, as in this case, personal perception. If the children are performing below standards, the board may need to allocate or shift resources to address the performance gap. And I don't want to oversimplify this. And I will say this, one of my favorite statements: data does not make difficult choices easy, but data can help explain why the decision was made.
Gotcha. And so kind of going off of that answer, could you share an example of how a data-driven decision data-driven decision making has positively impacted school districts?
I'd be glad to. Let's just continue with the example that we just highlighted.
Okay.
So we now know, based on data, that the children in this district are performing below the state standard. So we know that now. So now we can begin to ask questions of our data that allow us to dig deeper. What is the problem? What is it we need to understand? What's missing? What is it we're trying to solve? So we begin to disaggregate the data. And when I say disaggregate, it sounds like a big word, but actually just kind of separate. We'll talk about that a lot in the workshop. It's a big word for separating the data, asking which children are performing below standard. So it's a great question.
Yeah.
Are they at a particular school in the district? What if we discover the low-income children are performing differently than our high-income children? And can we give them additional resources, for instance, tutoring? So in other words, if we understand what the data is telling us about our children, then we can begin to allocate various resources to address. I call it targeting the need. So overall, data can guide the board to provide resources where they are needed to improve student performance.
Gotcha. And this sounds like you would get a very large wealth of information from a lot of the data points that districts are collecting. And not only are they getting all this data, but they're able to communicate it to the community and to the public in a way that, like you were saying earlier, it eliminates the bias and the personal perceptions of how their district is doing. Because if you asked all the board members separately how their district was doing, I'm sure they'd all have very different answers.
Absolutely.
But having it through this data lens, it kind of consolidates all these, everything into one funnel and says, like, here's how we as a board perceive or how we as a board analyze our data and how we're reporting our district is actually doing at each and every level.
Absolutely. Very well stated, Isaac.
Thank you. And you kind of hinted at this a little bit early in the podcast episode, but what's a key skill or knowledge that attendees will gain from learning this workshop? You kind of touched on it earlier about communicating it with the public. Could you get a little bit more depth into that?
Absolutely. We have a series of interactive activities. And what happens is participants learn that there are 5 key concepts that boards should keep in mind when using data to make decisions. And again, as we said, communicate with the community. And it's important. I can't say enough about communicating with the community. We're in a time now where a lot of people don't have a lot of trust. And so data can help build that trust as we communicate the data.
Sure. Yeah.
However, we need to consider 5 key concepts. And these, I love these. Work with me on these. Number 1, the first key concept we talk about is, remember, a picture is worth 1,000 words or 10,000 numbers. So how often have board members or anyone, and we've gotten rows and columns, just data.
Yeah.
But if you could take all that material, all that data, and if you could put it in a chart, a pie chart, a bar chart, there's all scattergrams, all kinds of ways. And it says so much to the person who may not be, first of all, who doesn't have the time to get through all the data. And you don't even know what you're looking at when you get rows and rows and columns of information. So the first thing we talk about, a picture is worth 1,000 words or 10,000 numbers. We also have another key concept is using color. And it sounds trivia, right? But basically, we do teach how to use color consistently to communicate to others and all. The third thing, and this is kind of my favorite, is we teach about asking guiding questions, using a set of questions that can be asked every time you look at data. When asked, remember I said before, when asked, how are you doing? Imagine if you ask yourself one question, compared to what? You're like, what does that mean? So how are we doing compared to standards? That's one way to look at data. It could be a local standard. It could be the state standards. But also ask yourself, how are you doing compared to self? Trends over time. So for instance, if last year 30% of our kids were at grade level and this year 50%, we may not be at 100%, but we are experiencing growth. And
Sure.
that's an important distinction to make. And people oftentimes are not patting themselves on the back for the great work that they are doing as they approach the standard. And then the other thing is compared to what? Compared to others. How are we doing compared to others? It could be other districts that are in the surrounding area, other districts that have the same demographics, maybe international. Some of our suburban schools actually use international benchmarks to compare themselves on. So again, asking the guiding questions, how are you doing compared to what? Standard, a self, trends over time, or others. The fourth thing, and I'll quickly move along, focus on the distribution of results. What does that mean? Simply stated, and we go into this in the workshop, avoid averages. Averages sometimes just don't give you an accurate picture of the data. And the fifth thing is disaggregate the results. Look at various student groups, children living in poverty, children that are immigrants, children that of different ethnicities as we begin to look at data. And these are things that we discuss and really go into depth in the workshop. And everybody, no matter what level you begin, trust and believe, we will all be at the same point when we leave the workshop.
Yeah, that's phenomenal work. I mean, I don't think you're talking about asking yourself these questions as a district. That kind of prompting, I think, really opens up the filter that you look at your data through. Because if you're looking at it very narrowly as how's our district doing compared to last year, and that's it, and you have no other metrics, you're not really giving yourself the benefit of how much this data can really take you into make future decisions. Like you said, you compare it to other local school districts or even ones in a different state or county, country, anything like that. You get so much, like a bigger picture, if you will, like you were saying. Could you maybe even use like the little report card to compare your stuff against?
Yeah, we absolutely go and we look at the school report card. And for those of you who may or may not be aware, it's a monitoring tool to view and analyze student achievement and performance data for the district. So it is important. Trust and believe. Families are looking at the school report cards. Realtors are looking at researchers, policymakers, and community members use that school report card to find school data. So it's important for board members to understand how to use it. So part of the workshop is to just look at the individuals, whatever districts it's in the room, we're going to look at their report card and begin to make sure we understand what it is communicating. We also have activity where, and I love this, participants brainstorm appropriate board level questions that they should ask when monitoring, specifically for their student learning goal. So they brainstorm and say, what are the appropriate questions? Because questioning is actually, I used to think it's an art, but I think it's a science as well. I think it's both. And also we'll talk about some of those appropriate questions. Then we'll actually show a list of some that the board members should think about when they're looking at data, asking the staff, because the staff are the experts in the data. They generate the data, they produce the data, and they live with the data. So the board members then need to be able to know how to ask appropriate questions. The data doesn't tell you the answer. It tells you where to start asking questions.
Gotcha. And we've had a lot of number talk so far in this podcast. I wonder if people might be listening like, oh man, I can't wait to go to a math class again. I mean, what makes this workshop engaging and unique to participants?
Yeah, I love the engagement. I would say, and I would say maybe 75% of the workshop is all about engagement. Let me just kind of back up with saying who is in the room.
Sure.
The participants for this workshop are the board and superintendent, which is not unusual, but we're also asking the superintendent to invite other members of the cabinet that access and generate the data. So we really have a data team. We have some experts. We have people that want to ask questions. And oftentimes, one of the things that I see is, some of the board members will say, wow, we get this big report. I don't know what does this mean? And then the person that generates it says, oh, we thought you wanted all this information. And so what ends up happening is that they begin to talk and collaborate and decide what is the important data that they need in order to make decisions. And if nothing else comes out of this workshop but that, I just get excited because sometimes we're not talking and we're not sharing, and they're doing their best to generate all this information, spending hours of time with information that the board members may not really need in order to do their job. So that's part of what makes this a little unique and engaging for members, because they're talking a group of people that sometimes may not have an opportunity to speak. It's interactive. You're rolling up your sleeves. You're working together.
Yeah.
We're not just looking at, for those of you who thinks it's just about numbers. We'll talk about the difference between quantitative data, which is numbers, things that you can measure, but we'll also talk about qualitative data too. We'll need to understand what other things are causing our children to learn or not to learn as well. And so we will unpack some of those items as well. But they'll leave with a plan as to what data should be used, the sources of data, how the data should look, and how they're going to monitor their own students' performance. Now, Isaac, I've talked too much, so I'm going to be quiet and let you say something.
Well, I'm really glad that you touched on the internal communication as well, because we have, as you've said in your answers, you've talked a lot about how the board can communicate this data to the public and to members of the school district. But touching on the internal aspect of it, I think is a really good point, because like you were saying, you have these experts in some school districts who their job is just to collect, analyze, and generate these reports. But if they don't know why they're generating the reports or who the reports are going to, who their audience is, it makes it kind of difficult to know what data to include, what not to include, and how to present it. Some people prefer a pie chart. Some people just want to see the raw rows and columns of the numbers. And so this workshop, kind of bridging that gap internally, really makes the board a lot stronger, encourages that internal back and forth throughout the school year, and also really positions the board in a position to accurately and be on the same page and be accurate about how they're presenting this data to the community. So I think this is a really, really good work to have not just the external communication, but the internal as well. I think that's fantastic.
How come Isaac has a way of saying what I just said so much more eloquently?
Oh, I think you did a great job. So thank you. So I think it would be good to kind of talk about maybe some prerequisites for this workshop, because I'm sure many districts would want to do it, but maybe their motivations are different, or maybe they're in a different place when it comes to data. There might be some districts collecting little to no data, or some collecting so much they don't know what to do with it. So what would you say are prerequisites for attending this workshop as a school district?
Sure. One of the things is, because we want to actually use your data, the district's data, throughout the workshop, we do ask them to come with their student learning goal. So that should be defined and agreed upon, and it should be something that's measurable. And so we will then talk about how are we going to monitor that goal. Now, if a district does not have one, we do have another workshop, district goal setting, which will allow them to say, okay, let's come up with some district goals. So, if you're not quite ready, that's okay. Your outreach director can then help you come up with some goals that make sense for your district. So we do ask that they come with a goal, and we're going to put that on the wall, and we're going to refer to it as we go throughout the workshop. And just an understanding of how they're measuring, how they're monitoring today. And it's not a right or wrong answer, because what we'll want to do is let's talk about what we're doing today, what's working, and what do we need to add. So just a basic understanding of how they're currently measuring student performance is necessary. And then we just ask them to browse their school report card. Let me just take a few moments, because we'll spend a little more time in the workshop. So not a lot. I mean, basically, it's having that student learning goal is what our expectation for a prerequisite.
Yeah, and it just goes to show another benefit of ISB membership is access to these workshops and getting that prerequisite taken care of one way or another. If you have it, great. If you don't, ISB is here to help, and we'll get a district goal set for you guys, and then we can go on to the next step. I think that just shows the strength of us as an association, able to provide these services to our members, and they take it, because I think these workshops are just really, really popular and really great.
Great.
So looking ahead in the future, what would you say some of the trends in data monitoring and analysis should school districts be aware of? Because we're in a very fluid situation right now. We've got a lot of AI technologies coming out and a lot of ways of collecting data that are unique and new to certain generations of students that maybe we haven't had access to before. So what would you say some trends are in this data monitoring analysis field?
Yeah, I think in some ways we're going back to basics. Let me just say why.
Sure.
As we were putting together this workshop, we were introduced to the topic of street data.
Okay.
And there's a whole book that's written on this thing called street data. And we're like, oh, what does that mean? But what it does is it challenges districts to look beyond big data, like the standardized tests, like the numbers, as the supreme measure of equity in learning. So street data reminds us that what is measurable is not the same as what is valuable, and that data can be humanizing, liberating, and healing. What it does is the street data takes us to the ground, and it wants us to listen to the voices and experiences of our students, staff, and families. So often, we give them our students tools and we give them all kind of techniques, after school programs. We do a lot of things for our students that are absolutely amazing. But what is really the experience that our students go through on a day-to-day basis that informs how they learn? And so street data says, let's go to the basics. And for instance, here's an example of an activity using street data. What about shadowing a student for a day? So often, we'll have a student shadow a teacher, etc. And this is where educators, with permission, follow a student through their school day. Imagine what kind of data you could collect, particularly from students who are out of the sphere of success. Is that kid hungry when they come to school? What did that kid go through before they even arrived at our school doors? And does that impact the learning? So I just love this concept of shadow a student, and more things to hear from those voices of those that we really, truly are not hearing from too. So yeah, it's kind of basic in some ways, but maybe we spend so much time concerned with the numbers that we may just forget about this concept of humanizing the data. Still, data, it's not quantitative data, it's qualitative data that informs our decisions as well.
I totally agree. That's pretty much what I was going to say as well. I agree. The amount of data you can collect nowadays and the ease of which you can collect that data is it's just astounding. But if you look at the experiences of students, and like you said, back to basics, in a way, it's still very novel. I don't think I would consider that a very out of the box way of collecting data to shadow a student, because it's not probably the first thing people think of. Like, how are our students doing in our school? Why don't we just go see at the ground level what they're doing and how they're interacting with one another? I mean, that you can't collect that kind of data from a survey. You have to kind of be there in person to see it.
That's right. And that's why they call it street data. They call the other data satellite data because it's kind of way above the hemisphere. But street data just goes to exactly where that child is, if we truly want every child to have an individual learning experience.
Right. Yeah. And again, that is such a really good idea to collect that data. And, getting insights like that from this workshop is why we offer it to school boards and members of ISB. And we just want to make sure that all districts are equipped with the best tools and resources they can to make the best informed decisions for their school district. That's what we're all about.
Absolutely.
Well, Sandra, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about this excellent workshop coming out of IASB. For anyone interested in attending this workshop or learning more about it, where can they do so?
They can contact any of their outreach directors or anyone else, any other number they have. We will get you the information you need. My name is Sandra Kwasa, KWASA. I'd be more than glad to talk with you. My guess is you would probably be directed to me by any of the people that you currently know at IASB. So a generic number, any number, asking for the monitoring workshop, asking for Sandra, I'd be delighted to speak with you.
Absolutely. And we'll have links to ways to find your outreach director, as well as a link to this workshop so you can get to learn more and get connected and hopefully get this in your district. Thank you again, Sandra. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. And thank you for your dedicated volunteer service to public education. If you'd like to stay up to date with future episodes, please consider following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube Music. Have a comment or question? We welcome listener feedback and invite you to leave us a voicemail via the link in the description or send us a voicemail at communications@iasb.com. Thanks.